Hello and welcome to the Preparing For series of webinars from Emergency Services Times. I'm Catherine Levin and I'm the editor of Emergency Services Times. As we move towards this year's Emergency Services Show, we'll now be focusing on preparing for every response. And today we turn to the topic of safer fleets, where we're delighted to partner with Haas Alert. In our webinars, we ask our speakers to share their work, insights and thoughts about the future. Our unique selling point is that we're multi-agency and you'll always get a view from across the blue lights. The webinar is a chat, it's no presentation, no slides, it's a valuable conversation that leaves you inspired to find out more. We have a Q&A function on our webinar software, so please do contribute questions, and where we can, we'll get a chance to bring those into our conversation. You'll receive CPD accreditation for joining us today, and once the webinar is over, you'll receive certification, and if you're watching on catch-up, you'll get it later in the month. Our plan today is to run for 50 minutes in total. So let's get started. I'll wait for my speakers to join us on the screen. There we are, fantastic. I'm delighted to introduce Gareth Evans and Dan Quin. Gareth is Strategy for Haas Alert, and Dan is Chief Fire Officer Service and the NFC for Road Safety. Welcome to you both.
Great to be here. Thank you.
Can you hear me okay, Gareth?
Yes, I can. Yep.
Excellent. Okay, just checking that. And Dan, can I hear you okay?
Yep, I can hear you well.
Brilliant. Okay. Just also to let viewers know that Jason Powell from the National Police Chiefs Council, who's a Director of Fleet at the Met, he is unable to join us today, so we're not going to get the police perspective, but we will try to make this as multi-agency as we can through Dan's experience of working with partners in Surrey. So let's start with the strategic context. We know that we have all the different types of roads in the UK. Road safety is something that's familiar to all of us who've grown up here. We did road safety as children, and cycling proficiency and all these things. It's very familiar to us. But in terms of the fire and rescue service, Dan, could you share with us what that means in terms of where it sits in your priorities and the kind of work that you're doing both locally and nationally to sort of set the scene for us from a fire perspective, please?
Yeah, no problem. So I have the honour of being the NFCC, National Fire Chiefs Council Road Safety and Road Rescue Lead, and they were previously two separate dimensions, so post-crash response versus the upstream education work. Very pleased to be able to join those up together, and that's a deliberate intent to make sure that the National Fire Chiefs Council are operating within the whole safe systems approach to responding to road-related risks. Part of what we're trying to achieve from an NFCC perspective, and I still describe myself as being new, even just over a year into understanding what the road safety context looks like, is there's a huge amount of work that's going on, very capable work amongst a number of different partners. But we are still, unfortunately, we don't have any desired targets for reductions in killed and seriously injured, and also in regards to our achievement of the decade of action, reduction of KSIs or road deaths, particularly by 50% by 2030. We're not on track to achieve that. So something needs to be done slightly differently. And so what I can do from a fire and rescue sector perspective is look to see how we galvanise all of the great work that our services are doing out there and how we can target it better. So in the context of road rescue, there's a very clear strategic narrative around our responsibilities in that area through the Fire and Rescue Services Act. But when you look in the road safety arena, it is unclear. In fact, there is an absence of a statutory responsibility. There's responsibilities upon local authority, which often do a lot of work around education, but particularly also within infrastructure. And then there's responsibilities on the police from an enforcement perspective. But to truly represent all of the safe systems, we need to get all the partners working consistently. So I have been working with our policy team within the National Fire Chiefs Council and all of our practitioners around the country, of which we now have representation from every fire and rescue service in the UK, which is great, to try and bring together a sort of position statement, something that we can all galvanise behind as our key priorities. The first one of those is around having a statutory responsibility for road safety. I think that will be really helpful in the context of local partnership working. It will give a clear understanding, supporting of the reasons for funding in that area. And particularly, it's in our strengths. We've got a good track record of doing real benefits when it comes to doing prevention-related activity. So firstly is about statutory function. Then is around the road safety partners. So you mentioned about the multi-agency working. My experience so far is that our colleagues are finding it very sporadic across the UK. There's some really excellent road safety partnerships, and there's some that are not necessarily as consistent or cohesive as they could be. So one of the things that we're going to be asking for is for some standards. Now, the standards could be similar to what we have within the Local Resilience Forum, where there's a very clear relationship around who does what the role of a different responder category is. And I'm not suggesting necessarily we have that explicit representation, but standards nevertheless. We need to have an understanding of who's going to be responsible for doing what, how do we work together, how do we helpfully hold each other to account. And then what we need to do as a fire and rescue sector is very much about how we do our business. So we've found through research looking at the sort of the risk that road traffic collisions pose across the UK that there is no benefit in trying to undertake it based on geographical boundaries. It's got to go beyond that. It's got to be at least a regional and arguably national approach. So we are going to be looking to make sure that as a sector we respond to research, of which there is a huge amount continuing to develop our understanding of what works and what doesn't work, but also that we're consistent in that national messaging, but we're also cognizant of the local context. So it takes us back to that statutory responsibility, and the benefit of working in really strong partnership is that's how I think we're going to disrupt what's already happening and make some improvements.
Okay. Before I come to you, Gareth, I'm just going to pick up on Dan's point about statutory responsibility, because we just happen to have a brand new government. So the Labour government is 1 week old, and clearly with a majority like they have, there is chance to influence and lobby to try and get new things over the line. What is the stance of the NFCC? Are they planning to lobby government through particular MPs or ministers or the APPGs, the all-party parliamentary groups? Do you have like a plan or a strategy for this?
So we certainly have a plan in that the position statement is effectively going to be our lobbying content. And also what we've been doing is working very closely with the National Police Chiefs Council in order to see if there's an opportunity to align some of the key sort of lobbying requirements that we have. And there is lots of synergies. And we are aware of other partners, say Road Safety Great Britain, Parliamentary Advisory, PACS, and RAC Foundation have already come together and put effectively like a manifesto for change to any government. It was pre the general election outcome. So our plan is to transition the position statement into effectively lobbying messages that we're going to definitely look to try and target the new roads minister, transport minister. But the message is that we want to sort of make that shift and get road safety onto the agenda and keep it there as part of some of those key sort of changes that they can make in the early stages.
Excellent. Okay, well, good luck with that, because they're going to have lots of people like you asking for time in Parliament. So Gareth, let's go over to you. So in terms of Haas Alert, not a company name that we're particularly familiar with, certainly in my sort of world of the emergency services. So I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about the company and what the connection you want to have with emergency services in the UK.
Yeah, absolutely. So first and foremost, our approach is we're a safety company. Essentially, when people are driving on the road every single day, they're encountering hazards, and that could range from emergency service vehicles, breakdown and recovery vehicles, school buses, or even other road users that have maybe broken down or they're stranded vehicles. In all those situations, there's a potential for danger on both sides of each of those situations. Essentially, our technology enables emergency services or other hazards on the roadway to send alerts directly into the vehicle, into what we term digital alerts, to warn drivers that they're approaching a hazard on the roadway or potentially a hazard is approaching them. So effectively, they can slow down, they can move over or take the necessary precautions ahead of time. So the idea and the principle here is not to be reactive. It's not to say, oh, there's something in front of me, I need to hit my brakes, but very much give that notification to drivers anywhere between 15 to 30 seconds in advance. And I describe it as it's that friendly tap on the shoulder that just says, hey, watch out ahead, or watch out, there's an emergency service come behind, please move out of the way before you can see the sirens and the blue lights.
Yes, because I mean, take my own experience of living in London. You hear it, you don't always see it, but you see the sounds of bouncing around the buildings as you're on the road. So, in terms of Dan, then, when you are putting the lights on a fire appliance in your case, or in a police car, if we had Jason with us, what are the kind of rules for that? So, is it just always in an emergency? Is it when can they use them? I have to say, I don't know what the actual rules are for this stuff. Let's find out.
Yeah. So in terms of when we would use an emergency response is only when there's been a reason to do so. So often it will be defined by individual fire and rescue services as what they would consider an emergency incident type to be. And often, as in the case in Surrey Fire and Rescue Service, our joint fire control that also provides call handling dispatch for East and West Sussex Fire and Rescue Services will give a clear understanding. If it's not linked to what we call a critical incident, they will give a clear understanding to the teams to say this is either an emergency or non-emergency response. And part of that is because undertaking emergency response has a potential to add significant risk to the road, in the way that people will behave as we're trying to make progress, and all the points that Gareth's already highlighted in terms of what could be done better. But in order to get somebody to be a blue light driver, we certainly don't place blue lights on every vehicle that exists within an organisation's fleet. There's a deliberate intent as to which ones will be able to use it and which ones not. To be able to even go so far as to switch them on, you need to go through all of the relevant training and assurance processes, and there's a maintenance of competence as well. So for me, for example, I still have to periodically go up and be assessed as a blue light driver. So there's with an instructor, highly qualified instructor, making sure that they can sign off on you in order to be able to use that facility. And the reason we do that is because statistically, there are actually still quite a number of incidents involving blue light vehicles. So there was 2,981 collisions involving fire and rescue authority vehicles just in England in 22-23. Now that was an increase from the previous year. It was a decrease from 10 years prior to that, but nevertheless, it's an increase. It's not something that's reducing. And that involves not just frontline appliances, fire engines, but it also involves officers' vehicles or other small vehicles. So there is a need to make sure that the principle of how you would utilize blue lights is effectively drive to arrive. The objective is that you're using them to get from point A to point B. If you don't get to point B, that effect is worse. So, whilst response times are always a consideration, the safety in terms of navigating through the roads is the priority.
Yeah. And so, Gareth, the work that you've been doing in the States, you mentioned earlier that in our pre-briefing call about some stuff with the FDNY, so New York Fire Department, huge conurbation, massive streets, buildings, people, busy. What's the sort of reasoning for a city like that? Is it the same sort of things that Dan's talking about? Does it kind of translate across the ocean like that?
Yeah, it translates globally. I think the same issues that we see in the United States, in Canada, in Europe, in Asia, the same common problems and the same common challenges are everywhere. We might not see some of the very severe cases, which unfortunately they see in the United States, but those problems still occur. If you have an accident, you've got not only the human cost and the social cost, but to Dan mentioned there, you've got an economic cost. If you're having a large proportion of your fleets, which they're not expensive, they're very expensive vehicles that are in the workshop for a long period of time and not on the road, fulfilling the duty that you want those pieces of equipment to do, there's that challenge as well. Whether it's the emergency services, whether it's tow truck operators, you go anywhere in the world, the same challenges are still there. And ultimately, everyone wants to get home safely, and be that them as the technicians, or also, making sure that the other road users can get home safely as well.
Yes. So the damage point is an interesting one. And then there's I'm not sure thinking about an HMI perspective in terms of thinking about the efficiency of a service. They're all emergency services, police and fire, obviously under HMI CFRS, thinking about making sure that the numbers are good when you're being assessed. Now, part of that is going to be how you arrive at the incident. But if you're arriving too quickly and you're not arriving safely, it's that balancing the two things out. Dan, do you find those sorts of conversations take place in terms of how you get there quick enough, but you have to get there safely? The phrase you used was drive to arrive, I think.
That's right. Yeah. Certainly. When, for example, with community risk management plans, the very basis of those plans is predicated on risk. But when we're engaging with our communities, the representation of what that actually means in practice is how quickly do I dial 999 and get a response. So there's a pressure on the response times rather than the understanding of the risk, for example. So that's going to always be an ongoing conversation, and certainly that's not something that's just orientated to our communities. That's an ongoing conversation that we have internally. Of course, we're going to have targets to sort of drive, pardon the pun, the need for response times to be as good as they could be, but the flip side is that obviously can never be done in the compromise of safety. Now, the reality is that not only would we be compromising the safety of our staff, which ultimately then can't do their job when they don't achieve the sort of end point, but also, depending on what happens, we'll be compromising the safety of people that previously weren't even involved in the incident. And that's certainly something, in my view, which is a real theme that we need to get a grip of. And that's why the National Fire Chiefs Council has got a dedicated theme related to work-related road risk. And for me, that's something that everyone can get involved in, because invariably we will be commuting, and often that's in vehicles, that we can make sure that we take that personal responsibility as to how we behave on the roadway and what we understand about the risks that we inherently bring onto it. So I hope that makes sense.
Yes, it does, because you are responding to the problem that somebody's having, but you're creating a risk by getting there quickly, and so you're having to balance that safety versus to get there, plus the efficiency and all of that. So there's a lot going on there. So one of the things we could think about is the infrastructure, the environment in which the vehicles are, both in terms of the members of the public, but also emergency vehicles. Gareth, could you tell us a little bit about this idea of smart traffic lights and how they can help emergency vehicles respond to achieve their goals of efficiency, getting there quickly but safely? What are smart traffic lights?
Yeah, absolutely. So the term that people will have heard a lot probably is V2I, so vehicle to infrastructure, or V2X, vehicle to everything. So ultimately, the traffic lights fit into that smart ecosystem. If you look at Netherlands as an example, around about 35% of all of their signals are connected. So what that means is their emergency services, as they're driving towards them, can do signal optimization automatically. So if there's an emergency service and it's on red, but it needs to be green, there is no manual input that needs to be done by a control center. It will turn the other sections to red, so there's no traffic that can go through, and then the ambulance, police car, wherever it might be, can get through that traffic much quicker. So this is automatically connected to those emergency service vehicles.
Okay, so Dan, is that something you're familiar with? You got them in Surrey?
I'm not sure whether we have them in Surrey. In fact, there's probably a gap I need to fill. But certainly, they sound like a really helpful addition in terms of being able to navigate through the traffic that's in Surrey, which is quite considerably higher than the national average. So any little addition will be greatly received.
Excellent. Okay. So thinking about the existing technology on blue light vehicles that would exist. So I had this sort of idea. I saw a police car recently. It had all these little boxes in the boot and all these things in it to kind of help it do its job, whether that's automatic number plate recognition, it's the system, the airwave system, or whatever it was. So is it a case that if a service was interested in having the Haas product, do they get a new box in their car? How does it work, Gareth? What is it you're kind of offering to the emergency services to help sort of solve some of the problems that we've been talking about here?
In short, it depends. So we can look at this in two ways. The key parts of what we do and the key mantra that we have when it comes to road safety, you can't do it alone. So we have an extensive partnership network. So that is working directly with government agencies, but then also to other providers such as telematics providers and other hardware providers. Some names that would be familiar in the UK, such as like Cradlepoint, Ace Tech, Standby Group, even coming over from Sweden. The way that we approach this is, if you already have connectivity in that vehicle, there could or there should be a way that we can start to implement in the back end. So not necessarily needing an additional hardware, additional wiring to go in. The benefit of that is, if you've got half your fleet which is brand new and you say, hey, we've already got this connectivity, we think we can connect through the cloud, fantastic. But then you say, oh, well, half our fleet isn't. We do have hardware that we can put in potentially in that older fleet, which then brings the whole fleet into that connective ecosystem. So then you've got the entire fleet providing digital alerts, but then you've also got that connectivity. If the local council decides that they want to implement some smart infrastructure, we've got a connectivity within those vehicles that can potentially connect to those smart traffic lights or the signage, as it were. But to answer your question, Catherine, it depends. But where we do not need to put hardware, we don't need to, because we'd actually prefer to partner with people that are already established in the vehicles themselves.
Right. Okay. I think that's probably quite a useful point to make in terms of investment and time off the road as well, presumably, because these will all need to be fitted out if it's physical. So Dan, in terms of the problem that we're trying to solve here for you, you're kind of working with Haas on a pilot project. So could you sort of set out for us what problem you're trying to solve with your service in the context of all the things we talked about, road safety, and how you're going about that in terms of improving things?
Yeah, no problem. So in terms of the problem we're trying to solve is that we know that there is an impact in terms of the amount of road usage to our ability to make progress. So anything that's going to enable us to be able to, as we discussed earlier, maximize the available time that we have to be able to respond from our deployment locations to wherever the incident is. Certainly what we want to do is reduce some of the evidential sort of human behavior that we witness, particularly in terms of it not being consistent, it in some cases being maybe erratic on certain cases, and particularly we don't want to force people into a position where they're not going to be safe. So there's those issues. But also then when we're at the scene, and this is something that, particularly in the context of motorways or fast roads, when you're putting in place fast roads procedures, very much you'll want to make sure that that remains a scene of safety. And certainly, whilst people have got better or more used to sort of signage and responding to signage, you still see people go through red X's. You still people trying to sort of join queues at a later point and get unnecessarily close to incidents that are occurring. Now, with utilising Haas Alert and systems like that, is very much able to give an early message directly into an infotainment system and be able to encourage that human behaviour to move sooner rather than just a physical sort of gantry-based sort of signage. And that for me is very much about protecting not only our staff but also the people that we're actually there to protect in the first place. So it's both sort of getting to the scene, making that safer, but also then when you're at scene, preserving the safety that you put in place.
Will you be putting the Haas Alert safety cloud, I imagine it's like a big cloud above you all, into all of your fleet? Do you intend to put it on all the fire appliances, all of the little cars, the office cars? What's your strategy?
Yeah, so sorry, I missed that bit. You're absolutely right. In terms of the arrangements that we're making with our fleet, we've gone through a program recently of embedding telematics and CCTV, and that is to supplement the management of our fleet, but also to make sure that, again, we're sort of monitoring the safety of our crews at all times. We're in early conversations with, for example, local police colleagues around how we could benefit using the CCTV for third-party referrals, for example, which will have a positive improvement in terms of driver behaviour, particularly where it's extreme. But by virtue of doing that, we're investing in the fleet, and actually this provides us with an opportunity to be able to expand the benefits. Because certainly CCTV and telematics on its own will not do what we've just described in terms of fixing that problem. It will help us to have a more efficient fleet management, definitely. We'll be able to potentially reduce the number of vehicles that we need across the fleet by using them better. But yeah, in terms of the problem, I think in the absence of something like Haas Alert, we won't really make much of an intervention through those changes.
Okay. So just thinking in terms, Gareth, of this kind of fleet. So if Surrey Fire and Rescue Service decide to invest in Haas, but they're the only ones within their blue light world, so thinking broadly within maybe the local resilience fund, we go across bigger pot of people. How much difference can it make if it's just one service? Is there kind of like a sense of a point at which you need to have lots more in order to really make the difference in terms of safety? What have you got from your experience of doing this elsewhere in other parts of the country in terms of like almost like a point at which it really becomes effective in terms of improving safety overall?
Ultimately, the goal, we want every single vehicle or hazard connected into our cloud so we can disseminate that information into the right way. But if we had one vehicle, it could be a fire truck, it could be a single tow truck operator that has one vehicle. If we avoid one crash, one near miss, one incident on the roadway whereby there could have been an injury or a potential fatality, I see that as a huge success. So yes, absolutely. Do we want the whole network being shared and really forming that ecosystem where hazard alerts can be shared equally amongst everyone? Absolutely. If that had one or two engines that were out and they were connected and the others weren't, would I class that as a success? Still yes, because we have that connectivity of those vital assets. Right. But the way that we're looking in the UK specifically at the moment, I would say I'm optimistic by the end of the year. We'll probably have about 8 to 9 different emergency services up and running in different parts of the country. We're already live with some tow truck operators. We partner with the IVR, for example, in the UK. Already live in several countries. So what's the area that people are noticing here is this information doesn't have to be in isolation. So if Dan wanted to share this information with the ambulance service, with the police, with the local authorities, he could absolutely do so. So then you're really broadening that road safety data that can facilitate across the network, across the region, and ultimately, hopefully across the UK as well.
Okay. Dan, can I just ask you, is it the case that when you dispatch fire engines to an incident, do you know what the ambulance and police are dispatching at the same time to that incident? Do you get all of that information in your technology systems?
So in short, no. It's still dependent upon a telephone conversation, but advancements such as multi-agency information transfer, which we're one of the services that piloted MATE, exactly, is a really is a really useful addition in terms of being able to share incident-related information and also potentially even the response information that services are providing. But very much the conversations I've been having with colleagues in National Highways around like their queuing systems that they have automatically, where you can get early indications of changes on the strategic road network, being able to integrate that information into tools like we use a dynamic cover tool that shows where everything is, what impact it's having to risk, the response times. If it's integrated into there, then you can get an early warning as to how you're going to have to separate your county potentially, or where you might want to stage resources. And better yet, if it's then integrated into the mobiliser system, you've got a much more mature live understanding of the risk that exists. And Haas Alert is another means of being able to get that type of integration, that early triggers of something happening and the ripple effects thereafter that follow. I mean, one of the things that we have the option to do is to do things like reverse access onto the strategic road network, but it's very risky activity. And one of the key requirements of being able to do it is that you're absolutely certain that nothing is going beyond the incident to the area where you're coming the opposite direction. And that can sometimes be really challenging when you've got big different distances between junctions. You might not be able to physically see it. You might be dependent upon CCTV, etc. But yeah, anything that's going to streamline that interconnectedness between the sort of control rooms will significantly reduce the time spent also in call handling before we respond as a group of emergency services. And that's, I know, one of the aims of MATE.
Excellent. Good. I'm glad we were able to draw that in. I've just noticed we have some questions. So let's go to those before we move on to our next topic. So the first one is a question for Gareth. Assuming that your system requires 4G and 5G network for delivery whilst working well in an urban environment, so my eyes are going with that. How about in larger rural geographical areas with poor coverage, for example, Lincolnshire? So maybe this is somebody from Lincolnshire, a very large, flat part of the country, very rural. So, Gareth, what's your thoughts on that?
So, with everything, there will be, some instances where there could be some areas and some spots where there's no coverage. Our typical approach to this is all over cellular signal. The reason being, so the terms shortwave and long-range communication are maybe terms that people have heard before. The reason why we work with the long-range communication is because we're developing that advanced warning system into those vehicles. That's key. And so we want to make sure that we can broadcast that information to the vehicles and to the navigation systems. So, there could be in isolated spots where there is no coverage. I know that we have done a piece of work over in North America, actually supporting some of the emergency services identify these spots. So using our using the cloud infrastructure, be able to showcase actually where the coverage drops for them, and using that as some level of evidence to go back to the telecommunication providers to say, hey, in these particular areas, we are seeing some black spots, and helping some of their evidence as well. But yeah, they could be in situations where there are those spots. We cover just over 3.5 or nearly 4,000 agencies in the USA alone, and in some of those areas they're extremely rural, and we typically don't see too many challenges with those types of emergency services in those regions. But there could be some instances where there is some black spots.
Okay, Dan, this makes me think of ESN. Might be a red herring, but do you have any sort of thoughts on connectivity and ESN in the future? Would that make any difference to what we've just been talking about there, or am I going in the wrong direction there?
I'm not entirely sure, to be honest. I know that there was a lot of work with ESN to make sure that if there was any areas of non-connectivity, then obviously that was being looked at and improved. Yeah. Certainly from my local experiences, we don't often have an issue with that particular situation. We're often well connected, including through airwave, but not only that, sort of 4G, 5G systems as well. And Surrey is largely sort of urban in the north and quite rural in the south and the southwest particularly. So we certainly haven't noticed that.
Okay, all right, thank you. So hopefully that answers the question. Next question we have, it says, is there a visualization of how this might work? Looking for pictures here. It's a little fire engine icon going to appear on my sat nav, showing where it is and the direction of travel. It's just quite interesting. I should have to ask that question myself. So Gareth, is that going to be? We're going to see little fire engines on our sort of ways in the car.
Yes, and it's already there. So yesterday I was with Rosenbauer at an Tech and Innovation Day yesterday, and actually there was a member of one of the fire departments that they actually on their way in, they said, it's really weird, on the way here I got a pop-up message and a fire truck on my ways, and they had no idea who we were, and I looked like I go, that was us. We connected that fire truck, and they actually got the alert driving into the yards and got that notification on Waze as a little fire truck.
Right, and so presumably there'll be police cars, ambulances, you'll have them all.
Well, let's say I'll change. It's an agnostic emergency service vehicle. That's what the icon looks like.
Oh, okay. So you don't know whether it's police, fire, ambulance.
It's very clear. It's an emergency service vehicle. So with our partnership with Waze, we work with them to see how we can best identify those emergency types of vehicles. Yes,
we said Waze a few times, but presumably there are other people doing these kind of sat-navy type things in cars.
Yes, absolutely. So So we're live on Waze and Apple Maps, and then we're looking to work with some other providers out in Europe as well, and obviously going directly into the vehicle on the infotainment screens.
Okay, all right. So next question, on the topic of alerts prompting driver reactions, do you have any thoughts on autonomous self-driving vehicles? Oh, we're looking into the future now. So what difference would that make? So if we've got our fire engines whizzing down the road to the incident, so we've got autonomous cars, how will this new world help us of making roads safe? Dan, is that something, do you think about that in terms of road safety in the future? Where does that fit with your agenda?
Yeah, it does, and it's a brilliant conversation to have, because obviously at the moment we're talking about something that is a realistic situation in other countries, and obviously emerging in our own. Certainly, we're hopeful that with the technology of that nature, will actually enable sort of overriding some natural human behaviour in terms of things like we mentioned about emergency corridors, and the fact that if we can enable the opportunity for people to operate in a consistent way, then that autonomous sort of vehicle intervention might enable that override and be consistent, and obviously dependent on the size of the vehicle that's coming in their general direction, be able to adjust for that. So that's really positive. We've talked about working with colleagues in National Highways with the work that they're doing around emergency refuges, that actually if you built in a level of infrastructure, for example, within an emergency refuge, it could also act as an early intervention for anything that perhaps perceived and realistic issues around maybe firefighting of electric vehicles, for example. You could have infrastructure built in that the vehicles could detect a problem and automatically navigate the vehicle to a place of safety. But I am aware that obviously there is experience in the US particularly where it has in some cases had the reverse effect, where maybe a vehicle hasn't recognized, and there was an incident occurred in June 2023 in San Francisco where a vehicle didn't recognize an emergency vehicle responding and wouldn't move out of the way, and caused a disruption to the response time. So there's certainly some challenges that may well exist, which are being learnt by other partners across the world, and obviously we get the opportunity to learn those in advance. But I think it provides a lot of benefits. Obviously there's the normal sort of risks associated with you're relinquishing control of the vehicle, and that in itself is quite challenging, quite a lot of anxiety, I imagine. Certainly it would be a leap of faith for anybody to be able to do that. But yeah, the more and more that technology becomes proven and tested, etc., I think it's an inevitability that we will have the autonomous vehicles more readily on our roads.
Okay. And Gareth, what's your experience of the discussions around autonomous vehicles? Is it something that you've seen a distinct growth in? Is it still kind of a sci-fi type stuff? I mean, where is it in terms of your wider sort of worldwide view on this?
It's from our perspective, we see it as a complete necessity. So we work with, as I mentioned, a good number of emergency services out in the United States, where they're experiencing this firsthand. They have completely autonomous shuttles and taxis in their cities, and surrounding areas that are live on the roads. They might be test routes, but they're on real world roads, and that's soon going to be the case in the UK. So the question that we say is, how are you connecting these vehicles, or what mechanisms do you have to connect with any form of, whether it's level 3 autonomy versus a completely autonomous vehicle? And right now they're not connected, or there's no link to connect them to those vehicles. So this is another area that's really important for us, working both with emergency services, with tier 1 and actual autonomous vehicle manufacturers, is how we can actually connect to the emergency services. The challenge on the UK roads in a very, very near term, you're going to have vehicles on the road, and the average vehicle age in the UK is about 10 years. You're going to have semi-autonomous vehicles and completely autonomous shuttles. So how, as an emergency service, are you going to connect with everyone? And it's going to be very difficult. So this is where we try to plug that gap of the connectivity. We're not building those autonomous vehicles, but we are giving you the opportunity to have that connection to them. The same with the traffic lights or the smart infrastructure, just been able to almost future-proof the fleet. So when they are on the road, at least you have that an ability to connect.
Yeah, it's interesting there, because the next thing we were going to talk about was around driver distraction. And presumably an autonomous car doesn't get distracted like a human, because ultimately it's about human behavior, isn't it? It's about how you drive your car when you get the phone call, you have your slurp of your tea, you get distracted by something out there, you listen to something amazing on the radio. Is all of that just still going to happen? People are still going to behave in the way that they behave. So by putting Haas into Waze or similar systems, and the emergency services having that ability to alert them, will it ultimately get rid of all those distractions? Because you'll basically overtake the infotainment, I think is the term, in the car. Is the idea it kind of just takes it over and that's it? Can they still listen to the radio? Can they still have a cup of tea? What does it look like?
Absolutely. So in terms of how these alerts actually look and present themselves in a vehicle is very dependent on the car manufacturer themselves. So we were very fortunate and the relationship and the partnership that we have with Stellantis, who are one of the first car manufacturers to bring this into their vehicle. Their approach was to bring it into the infotainment system with a real short message, but real clear about what that situation was on the road. Was it emergency service? Is it a broken down vehicle? Is it a work zone? To be really clear.
Right. So that should be quite descriptive. Is it audio? Is it something that someone would hear rather than read? Because you're going to be reading it, I suppose.
So it's the short message, and the way that this works with themselves, there's an audible chime, and if you're listening to a podcast or whatever you might be doing, it brings that down in terms of the volume. Right. Short message, and that.
Okay.
With other manufacturers that we're working with, it looks slightly different. So it's not necessarily the infotainment system; it's in the cockpit or the heads-up display that goes onto the windscreen. Slight vibration of the steering wheel. The great aspect of this, the technology is there. It's just how they want to adapt this into what's the most practical way to alert drivers, but also doesn't harm the driving experience. They've got a very important role to keep drivers safe, but ultimately they also want to make sure the driving experience is a good one for those. So if they are getting those alerts, it's in the right way and in the right form that they can do the right.
What kind of testing takes place, Gareth, for something like that? How do you have like a bunch of drivers who it's tested out on to see how they react, and sort of maybe their physical reactions, their mental reactions, how they felt about being interrupted, whether it made a difference in terms of how they drove? Has all of that been kind of tested?
Yeah, so it's a combination of both. And as we go into the different car manufacturers, they'll be looking at this in slightly different ways, again, depending on how they're putting this alert into those vehicles. So that Stellantis is a great example where there's so many iterations about what was the right timing, what was the right volume of chime, what was the right message. And one of our key areas is working with the authorities in each country to make sure that we're working with both road authorities and at the national level to say, these vehicles are going to be on the roadways, but the message that might be in a Jeep in the US could be very different than a vehicle in the UK roads or in Spain, in Hungary. So taking those nuances is really important as well, and bringing both the OEM, ourselves, and the various different government entities, road authorities to the table is super important as well. Yeah.
So think about the other end of that. So Dan, when you're doing your pilot with Haas, what will it look like in the vehicle that the emergency services person is driving? So if they're in a fire engine, what does it look like?
So in all of our fire engines, we have satellite navigation systems. So it would be able to be connected in some way to that. And or we have mobile data terminals as well, which are effectively like a tablet device that sits on the front seated passenger's side, that the officer in charge of the vehicle will be responsible for. So we have a number of devices that could provide the connection to the information. But I mean, for me, like Gareth described, that balance in terms of how you draw people's attention to, but also, and then get the response that you require, but also override the distractions that you've described.
Yes.
For me, distractions is one of the biggest challenges we have in road safety, because it's not dependent upon speed, it's not dependent upon vehicle type, road. It's there all of the time by human behaviour, and it's choice. And so if we can do anything that sort of drives down distractions as well through our road safety interventions, then that's, I think, where there's a key opportunity to make a real benefit.
Yeah, and I think when it's really easy to think about distracted driving as just someone on their phone. It is the sip of the coffee, it's talking to your friends, it's asking the kids in the back to put something down. I'm sure Dan's had this experience where I see it all the time, where there is an emergency vehicle. They can't be more obvious that they're behind someone, and you're thinking, how is that person not seen this big blue flashing light vehicle behind them? They still haven't moved out of the way. So anything that we can interrupt that driving behavior in a positive way is a benefit.
Excellent. So we have about 5 minutes left, so I'm just going to touch on a little final subject before I ask you to give us your advice for our listeners today, and that was around emergency corridors, Dan. So Surrey is covered in motorways, I understand. So what do emergency corridors do in terms of improving road safety and helping the whole conversation we've been having today? Is that something that we should be introducing? What is an emergency corridor?
So emergency corridors, and apology, I mentioned it earlier without the context, but so
that's okay.
Emergency corridors are known within Eastern Europe. They're practiced well in many of their countries. They're built into things like the highway code. They're inherently as part of sort of driver behaviour. And basically what it does is it effectively enables a corridor by the consistent movement of the vehicles when they know an emergency vehicle is approaching to operate in the same way, a corridor within the sort of lanes. But it's dependent upon road type, they will operate in a consistent way, whether it's strategic road network or not. Now, like you said, Surrey has got quite a considerable amount of strategic road network. And as mentioned earlier, some of the junctions are really distance is quite long. So to be able to get access to an incident that's occurring, particularly if it's all lane running, things like emergency corridors will have a fundamental difference. Rather than in front of you as a driver, you're watching people weave among each other in terms of trying to make a pathway, which they genuinely do, in most instances. Yeah. But if there was a natural opportunity that everybody operated in a consistent way and moved out of the way before you got there, you would avoid what Gareth's talking about when you're behind somebody going, why have they not seen anything? Because everyone else, you'll get a glimpse of everyone else doing a similar sort of thing, and therefore you can be consistent with that response. So I think there's a significant place for emergency corridors.
Okay. All right. Excellent. So we're coming up to time now. So I'm going to ask you both to give me a piece of advice. So what is the thing you'd like our listeners and the people watching us today to think about when it comes to road safety, and in terms of the kind of alerting that you've been talking to us about from Haas today, Gareth? So let's start with you. So what's the piece of advice you'd like people to go away with and think about, and perhaps chat with their colleagues about after this?
I think it's definitely a buzzword, but I think that collaboration is key. The way that we approach any challenges on the roadway, not one person can fix this problem on their own. We use the example. We work with partners that do wrong way driving detection and stop vehicle detection. But then we partner with them because then we can actually get that message across. So it's not one person can do everything when it comes to road safety. And I think it's really important when we look at this from the emergency services as well, as how we can really help that cross collaboration. So if there's a call, if there's a 999 call, to be able to activate that through the control center to say, hey, let's raise an alert straight away. Then you've got connected vehicles that are going to these instances where they can get there quicker because people are moving out the way and more safe and safely. And then when the situation is clear, the road sign automatically changes to road now clear. You can drive safely. Yeah. All of that can't be done in isolation, but it's not a technology problem. The technology is there. It's just gathering that data and putting that data in the right place. So for me, it's collaboration and from my perspective, anyone that wants to have a conversation like this, I'm more than happy to as well.
Excellent. Thank you, Gareth. And Dan, how about you? What's your piece of advice?
I think my advice is about appreciating risk. So if you're popping down the shops around the corner, just taking a short journey, or you're driving to another part of the country, the risk that you, as a driver in charge of a vehicle, which is inherently safe until a human gets in control of a vehicle, the risk that you are adding to those around you in the road. And I suppose the key takeaway for me beyond that is that everybody is invariably doing commuting of a certain nature relating to work. Now, as an organisation, you have a responsibility under health and safety legislation to make sure that you have an assessment of risk. Are organisations genuinely considering what it means to manage work-related road risk? And I'd suggest that in the vast majority that isn't being considered or isn't being actively encouraged. And I'm talking about policy changes like not only will you not answer your phone, but you won't do it through hands-free devices either because of the risk that can do to distraction. So as a sort of giveaway, a tool that is available for people to use, which is through national highways, is known as Driving for Better Business. If anything, from here, go away and have a look at that and see how you can integrate it into your management of health and safety risks.
Excellent. So 2 very good pieces of advice. Thank you very much for that. So unfortunately, we have run out of time. It's been a fascinating discussion. I think we've learned a lot about the potential that Haas has to improve road safety, lots about how safety works from a fire perspective, but I think a lot of those messages were very applicable to other emergency services. It wasn't just about being in a fire engine. So despite our loss of Jason, I think we've managed to cope quite well with that. So thank you very much for that. So I just thank you very much for joining me today. I'm going to do my wrap up now and talk about what's coming up next for our webinars. So thank you very much for joining us. And our next webinar will be on the 25th, so that's next Thursday. If you want CPD accreditation, you'll receive that by email very soon. The final webinar, I'm muddling myself up a little bit, but we'll go back to the webinar. So on the 25th of July, we will be talking to colleagues about extreme heat. So we're looking at climate change impacts. So that's the next in our series on those. So please sign up for those with us after this recording. Do visit our website, which is emergencyservicestimes.com, where you can sign up for our daily and weekly digests. And we are publishing news every day. It's very exciting now that there's a new government, there's all sorts of new things going on. So do keep in touch with us. And it just leaves me to say thank you very much for watching.